The Medium is a game by the same studio that gave us Observer, a game which I have reviewed in the past. This time around, the developers have both a much larger budget and greater ambition, which shows. However, let's approach this review one step at a time and start with the obligatory ultra-wide support. Currently, the game supports both 21:9 and 32:9 natively, although it does appear to come at a cost of the field of view, which cannot be increased and creates a zoom-in effect. This is mostly noticeable when you play in 32:9, and while it is annoying, I am willing to forgive it. Normally I'd say that any ultra-wide is better than none, but that wasn't always the case here. In fact, if you look at the Steam forums, you will notice that at first the devs literally stated that implementing this would be so hard that it's basically next to impossible and they won't do it. This of course is laughable. Guess how long it took modders to achieve the impossible? Hours. Yep, just a few hours. While the particular developer who made that comment never admitted that this statement was an attempt at bullshitting the players and the real reason was laziness, the game did at least receive a patch which enabled ultra-wide after this moment. Hopefully they will learn from this experience. When starting the game, we are literally presented with a so-called trigger warning, and I'm doing quotation marks with my fingers here. That right there was a huge red flag for me. I find it especially annoying since this game has a mature rating of 18+, and yet we need a warning that it might, and I quote again, trigger us. From that moment on, I was sitting on edge, expecting to be bombarded with woke propaganda for the duration of my playthrough, but to my surprise, no such thing ever happened. What did appear, however, were flickering textures, random stuttering, and other minor technical issues. Luckily, those never lasted for too long and were not common enough to do more than annoy me slightly. On the other end, the weird blurriness did. If you look at my character carefully, you will see how she appears slightly pixelated or blurry at times. This is luckily also rarely the case, but it can be pretty worrying when the first scene of the game immediately presents most of its technical issues all at once. If we put that aside, the game actually looks really nice most of the time, although I have to wonder why they have used these weird fisheye lens effects in some of the scenes. It happens very rarely, but when it does, it really bothers me. Just look at this. What's the point of it? It's as though the walls are being bent by the camera as it moves. I don't know, it just looks really weird to me. And speaking of camera movement, you will quickly notice that the game has static camera angles for each individual scene. Clearly they were inspired by Silent Hill, since they even hired Akira Yamaoka to do some of the game's music. And speaking of that music, I have to say that Yamaoka has mostly lost his touch. Yes, there were a few decent tunes in the game, but for the most part it was all very generic to me. The voice acting on the other end was on point. All the characters sound believable and play their roles perfectly, which really helps during the first act of the game, since that's the more boring one. Now back to the static cameras. The issue with those is that they make the character movements confusing and annoying. Playing with a keyboard and mouse is clearly an afterthought, since it both feels clunky and has terrible default key bindings. The developers even leave you a message saying that they advise you play with headphones and a gamepad. And here's an example of some terrible key bindings, by the way. If you want to run diagonally to the right and simultaneously use our protagonist's ability to sense the supernatural, you have to press W and D while simultaneously holding Shift in order to run and Control in order to use the sense. Try it out on your keyboard and you will see what I mean. W, D, Shift and Control with the same hand on your keyboard. It's a nightmare. If you do happen to have a gamepad which you can use with this game, make sure that it's one for Xbox, since PlayStation button prompts are not available here. I wonder if I should ask the devs in the Steam forums about it, but I kind of fear that they will just tell me it's simply impossible to implement, just like they did with the Ultrawide feature. And now let's talk about the gameplay. While it's clear that the devs have tried to recreate the spirit of Silent Hill here, they didn't manage to do so. The Medium is not a scary game, not at all. In fact, it doesn't even appear to want to be one for the most part, especially because our protagonist has had the ability to contact the world of the dead for the duration of her whole life and is absolutely unimpressed with it at this point. Being able to see the dead and see in a different dimension is her version of normality. I actually like that about her. She acts like a real person would after having seen something hundreds of times. The gameplay does not involve any combat. We will walk through the levels dealing with mostly simple puzzles and occasionally hiding or running from a monster. Normally I would totally hate this, but the sections are short, the monster is not too annoying, and most of the checkpoints are placed close enough. Although there were a few times when the game actually placed the checkpoint nearly 20 minutes back, which really angered me since I died and had to redo a lot of what I had done in these 20 minutes. Our protagonist's name is Marianne and she can communicate with the realm of the dead. This goes so far that she can even interact with it in various ways. One of the main features of this game is called dual reality. When we enter such a section of the game, the screen will split and we get to control two characters at the same time, one in the real world and one in another realm. During these sections, we get to interact with objects and puzzles in both realms simultaneously, which sounds a lot more complicated than it really is. This feature is controversial in my eyes because the developers of this game even went so far as to patent it. Yes, you heard that right, there is a patent on the gameplay feature right now. Allow me to tell you why this is absolutely unacceptable. First and foremost, they did not invent this gameplay feature. Here's footage from a game that's nearly 10 years old, which uses it, and I'm sure that I could find more examples if I tried. The second and main reason why I find this unacceptable is that this will end up causing other companies to look for ways around the patent if they want to use something similar. I honestly can't imagine anyone wanting to pay them for a license in order to use this gameplay feature in the exact same way. This hurts creativity, it hurts the consumer, but it also hurts the industry as a whole and sets a dangerous precedent. And that coming from a developer who basically copied gameplay mechanics from Silent Hill in this exact game. Just imagine if id Software had patented the first-person shooter, or if Max Payne patented bullet time, etc. The greed and disregard for the etiquette in this industry displayed by this developer are both unacceptable in my eyes. The good news is that the dual reality in this game is by no means something to brag about too much. Most of the time it feels like a restriction on multiple levels. Whenever it activates, the player will usually only focus on one of the screens and ignore the other one for the most part. I've read quite a few instances where people straight out ask if it's possible to disable the feature, as it really isn't needed. You could simply replace it with a button that flips the reality, since you can usually see outlines of objects from another reality anyway. I personally found this feature interesting, especially during the cutscenes where we see our character interact with ghosts while simultaneously we see her on another screen where she just appears to be talking to herself. But is it something that is worth putting a patent on? I'd say absolutely not. And I would be remiss if I did not mention the running of our character in this game. We get a designated button which makes our protagonist run. However, that feature has a mind of its own. Many times the game will simply not allow us to run since we are in a room or in a corridor, and it just doesn't want us to do so no matter how much we press the button. Sometimes we are allowed to run but at the same speed as if we walk, so it makes no difference. And in other instances the speed is only ever so slightly faster. It really is bothersome. Then there are the scenes when you are chased by a monster and our heroine suddenly knows how to jog properly at a more acceptable speed. This issue is not unique to the medium and is something that has always annoyed me a lot whenever I encounter it. And now it's time to talk a bit about the game's story. Since the gameplay is so limited, the story is what will ultimately hook the player. The concept itself is quite interesting. Marianne is a medium and can interact with the realm of the dead. The game's rules are quite inconsistent when it comes to this, however. At one time the game explains that Marianne is simultaneously in both realms and we cannot progress in one realm if there's an obstacle in the other realm for her to move through. We even see that, for example, if there's a locked door in the real world and an opening in the other one, we can't just go through since both characters need to move at the same time. Our heroine can split from her ghostly self, giving us a limited time in which we can control only the spirit. If we stay separated for too long though, our spirit will fade away and it's game over, unless it's not. What I mean by that is that sometimes the story or level design will demand that we control only the spirit version of our character. In those cases, there's no split screen, there's no time limit, which I personally appreciate of course, but also find a bit strange. While I'm not excluding that there might be an explanation for this in the game, the fact that I can't tell you what it is indicates that it was explained poorly or not at all. It's just sometimes there are specific rules for something and at other times, inexplicably, we are allowed to do it without any restrictions. for as much as we want. So the story starts in a very secretive manner. We get a call from an unknown person telling us to go somewhere. Our character can feel that this is important and decides to do as instructed. As mentioned, the first act of the game is a bit slow and boring since we are not yet aware of what is happening around us. And while we will be given multiple small hints about what is about to happen and how this connects to our character, most of you, just like myself, will probably not realize what these hints mean until they're explained a bit further. This is not a bad thing, I actually enjoyed this, but I'm just saying that the first part, personally for me, was quite boring. Obviously I don't do spoilers, so I can't tell you much about the story itself, but let this much be said, the second and third act really give us more interesting details which clear things up by the end of the game. The story does deliver and I was hooked after about 4 hours of playing. By that time I knew I had to see what happens, and this was also the point at which I did not stop until I reached the end credits. The topics became more mature, the characters more interesting, and the story more entangled. The supernatural element only made things even more interesting in my eyes. My biggest complaint about the story is that it ends on a cliffhanger. This is clearly because there will be a sequel, but is a major sin in my eyes nonetheless. Our protagonist is presented with a difficult choice, and before we actually get to make that choice, the screen fades to black without showing us what happened. I can pretty much assume what transpired once the screen faded to black, but I still found it very annoying. A better approach would have been to give the player the choice, or to tie the ending to some previous actions and present us with two difficult outcomes based on those actions from the past. Then, as the sequel comes out, one of these outcomes could be labeled as canon, while the other one was just an alternative ending. It just lets the player feel in control and provides us with an actual ending, rather than a literal fade to black and an open ending. At the end of the day, I enjoyed playing the medium. Make no mistake, it's definitely not in any way a Silent Hill kind of game, and has its own share of technical as well as other issues, more related to the developer's behavior when it comes to ultrawide implementation and patenting of game features. And while one could argue that these issues are not really relevant when judging a game, I have to address them just as much as the technical ones, because I feel a responsibility to inform my viewers about all the things that come out when I do my research. If I had to judge the game in a vacuum, where I ignore everything outside of it, I'd say that it's a game with technical issues, relatively boring gameplay, but a good story which unravels slowly but does a good job at keeping your interest and mostly makes up for the game's shortcomings. The medium is not a masterpiece, but it brings some creative ideas to the table and is a substantially better game than Observer was. If you do decide to give it a try, please consider buying it on GOG.com. I'm not affiliated to them in any way, but I support their fight against DRM because I believe that we should own the games we buy and not be reliant on online launchers to play them, regardless if that launcher is Steam, Epic, Uplay, etc. They are all bloatware in my eyes. And if that's not reason enough for you, the medium is currently 20% off on GOG.com, so you are not only buying a DRM-free version of the game, which you will actually own, but you are also paying less for it than you would, for example, on Steam. With that having been said, I would like to thank you for watching Game Filter. I hope my review has been entertaining and informative, and I would love to see you again next time. Until then, this is Nino signing off. Have a great day.